Hi kids, I am in the other room today because I wanted to talk about this wall. Some of you, this is your normal class, and so you've seen this lots of times. But if you haven't really seen it much, I wanted to kind of go through it and explain it and make sure you understand. It's a really cool color-coded way to look at the books of the Bible. So hopefully you can see all the different colors really well. Maybe that first one where you see Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those are pink, and these other ones starting with Joshua are red. So what's interesting is all of these are color coded and they're in order of how they are in the Bible. So this one starts with the Old Testament, so you can see the Old Testament marked up here. And then all the pink ones, you look down here, and the pink ones are the books that are about the law. So that's how they're categorized, because they're about the law. And we remember that Moses is the one that wrote those books. Then all the red names that you see, all the red books of the Bible, are the books about history. So if you love history, those are where we've been in lots of these about the kings and what happened in Israel when God divided the kingdom. So all of that is in this section of red. And then we have an orange section. And so you see down here, this is the poetry and wisdom books. And so you recognize probably Psalms and Proverbs, but also Job and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon are part of poetry and wisdom. Then we have all of these books, the yellow and the green, finish out the rest of the Old Testament. And so we talked about prophets. And so the prophets are divided into two categories. The yellow are major prophets and minor prophets. So you remember last week we were in this one, Jonah, the minor prophet, because it's called minor mainly because it's a smaller book, it's a shorter book, and these yellow ones are all very long books. So if you were to look up how long Isaiah is, it has lots of chapters. So that first three columns here on the wall are the Old Testament. And then we get to here, and it's showing us how the New Testament is divided up. There's not as many groups, but we can see it down here. This lighter blue color is called the Gospels, and we know that from learning about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We would do that a lot when we were talking about the New Testament. Those were some of Jesus's disciples also. And then we also have books of history in the New Testament. So you can see there's only one, but Acts is telling us all about the early church and how the church was started. So that one, it kind of looks maybe the same color as Romans, but it is a little different color. So we have kind of a lighter blue, Acts is a medium blue, and then starting with Romans all the way to Philemon, those are the letters of Paul. So he wrote lots of letters to different churches. And so those are all of that. And then the last big group is the purple, and that's general letters. So those were other letters that maybe were written by other people besides Paul. And then we have the very last one, that light purple one, Revelation. And that's when God tells us about things that will happen. And so those, I thought, if you haven't really studied this on the wall, I thought it was worth us looking at today. We're going to be, I'll give you a hint, we're going to be in a book today that is still in this history, but it's all the way to the last one, Esther. And so you probably know a lot about Esther, but we're going to talk about a few things in the book of Esther today. So our story here in the book of Esther begins with the main character, Esther. I'm going to write some other characters here as we go that are some main characters, but let's talk a little bit about the setting of what has happened when we get to the story of Esther. So You can look at the end of 2 Kings in chapter 25, verses 8 through 12. This is describing that a king came to Jerusalem. This is where Israel was, and they came to the city of the Jerusalem, and they burned and destroyed everything. And they carried several of the Israelite people away as they, kind of like if you say someone took a kid, they kidnapped him, but they were taken away to another place. And we're going to put that place over here, Persia, and a city named Susa, which is where the story of Esther is taking place. So this is a place that's very, they do not believe in God at all. And this is, we would say they're enemies of Israel because they had attacked them and taken them prisoner and taking them to Persia. And so what's interesting about the book of Esther is a few things. It's not really about, you don't hear Israel mentioned very often. You hear Persia mentioned a lot. And the city of Jerusalem has been destroyed, and they talk about this city, Susa, where they are. And so the people of Israel, the people that do know the true God, are having to live in this place where it's an unbelieving place. They do not believe in the one true God, but we're going to see that how God works. But what's really interesting is the word God is never one time mentioned in the whole book of Esther. That seems very strange to us because this is a book about God. The Bible is all about God. And we've learned that everything is leading to the story of Christ. And so why does this book leave out God? Does that mean he wasn't working in this part of the Bible? Well, think of it this way. It was kind of God is teaching us something through that even though in this book God's name is not mentioned, he was always working behind the scenes in this place that was run by a king who did not believe in God. But what you're going to see at the end is God was always working to protect his people and to make sure that line of David kept going and would go all the way to Christ. And so even though there have been times that it looked like that might not happen, God has always preserved his people. And we're going to see that he was always working behind the scenes. Now, I wrote a big word on the board. That's for some of you older kids, but if you don't know how to say it, you might say the word coin. It doesn't have to do with money. We say this word, a coincidence. And so I'm going to give you an example of somebody using this word, and you can see if you can figure it out. Let's say you went to Chicago. It's a really big city, really, really big. I could go to Chicago too. And so you went with your family, and I was going, and I was going to be there the same day. And lo and behold, we see each other in this big place, Chicago. And we hadn't planned, we didn't even know that each other were going to be there. But somebody say, oh, what a coincidence, I saw you there. Well, when we think about what God does, where he's always in control, he's planning everything. We learned about that word sovereign. He's all-knowing. He's in control of everything that's happening. Probably that's not a word we really use the same way other people do, because we believe God for sure had that in his plan. And so we're going to refer to these little coincidences in the book of Esther that were not just something that happens. The definition of coincidence is something that happens, kind of a remarkable, amazing thing that happens, but there's no real explanation for how it happened. Well, we know the explanation is God planned that. He was following what his plan was, and that is how he planned it out. So our lesson goes through and it has 9 different coincidences or remarkable ways that things happened, but they're pointing out that we don't really think they just happened. We know that God was working behind the scenes and he planned that. So if you remember, this country, Persia, had a king and a queen. And it was a very fancy, very rich country, very nice things. And so they had this huge party for a lot of days. And I would encourage you, the book of Esther is a little longer than the book of Jonah, like we talked about last week, but it's only 10 chapters, and I think you would really enjoy reading through and hearing all the different things that actually happened to Esther, because I'm going to only be able to summarize the kind of main events. So what happens, and how this is how God starts, is the king of Persia ends up kind of, the queen makes him upset because he asks her to come and she will not come. And so some men in his kingdom that give him advice said, oh, you should not let her be queen anymore. So that's what he did. And this is how Esther becomes the queen. He had all the young women come and he ended up picking Esther. Now, what's interesting about that, Esther is from Israel. She's a Jew. And the people there had been living in Persia for some time, and so she was one of them. Now, she is being, if you read about her, you can read about her in the first chapter, but she is not being raised by her own mom and dad, but by other family member named Mordecai. And so he's another very important character in our story. And so he tells Esther not to tell anyone right now that she is a Jew or that she's from Israel. And so she obeys that and she does what he says. And so we know, if you've heard the story of Esther, we know that she is picked by this king of Persia and she is going to be the next queen. And what's interesting is there's one night that Mordecai, which was related to Esther, he kind of heard of some plot against the king, that somebody was planning to do something to the king, and Mordecai found out about it and he stopped it. Well, you would have thought that that was really good and the king would have heard about that and given Mordecai some maybe special recognition or something. But we hear that after he discovers this bad thing that was going to happen to the king, the king didn't promote him, he promoted another man, and he's another kind of big part of the story, another character, Haman. And Haman was from Persia, and he hated the Jews. And so this king puts Haman in a very high position. He's going to be very important. Well, what ends up happening is Haman has a plot to destroy or kill all of the Jewish people that had been brought here as prisoners. They've been living there and making a life there, but he says, no, we're going to get rid of them. And so he convinces the king to go along with this. And so, like, in 1 month, there is a day, and you can read about this in chapter 3. There's a day that it says that all of the Jews in the land of Persia are going to be killed. And so, of course, you can imagine that even the people of Persia are kind of shocked about that. But, of course, the Jews are very concerned about that. And so Mordecai talks to Esther because right now Haman, or the king, don't realize that Esther is a Jew. And so now Mordecai is going to go to Esther, and it says in chapter 4, you can read about this part. Mordecai learned all that had been done, and he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out and cried aloud. So he is very upset and distraught, and he knows that he's a believer in God. And so he is mourning, he's sad, but he is going to do something about it. And so he is able to go and talk to Esther. And so this is kind of a very important part of the story. Now remember, God is still not mentioned, but we see God using people, even though the Jews were in this place, he still was using those unbelieving people, the king there, Haman, to accomplish his purposes. And so Mordecai tells Esther, and this is at the end of chapter 4, Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. So he believes that God is going to do something, but he also thinks Esther is there for a reason. But you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So she told Mordecai to gather the Jews, and they were not going to eat or drink for 3 days. We would say that was a fast. And they were going to be praying for this situation. So this is what we find ourselves in. So we are here in this story, and Haman is trying to kill all the Jews. Well, what ends up happening is he is thinking that Mordecai is making him very upset. And so another one interesting, I like this part of the story, coincidence that some people would say, but we know that God planned that. One night the king couldn't sleep. And so they had all the record books come, and they read to him out of those books. And usually that would be kind of boring to listen to. So maybe he thought he would fall asleep because it was so boring. But he happened to read that about the plot that happened like 5 years ago, before, about that Mordecai had found out that somebody was going to hurt the king, and he stopped them. And the king said, well, wait, what was done to reward Mordecai? And they said, well, nothing. It doesn't say that we did anything. And he's like, well, we need to reward him. Well, Haman was planning to tell the king that Mordecai was so bad and they needed to kill him. And so Haman was actually coming in to see the king to tell him that they should kill Mordecai. And the king asked Haman this question. He's like, Haman, I want to honor somebody because they did something so amazing for me and I never rewarded them, and I want to honor them. What would you say would be the best way to honor them? And so Haman said, oh, the king must want to honor me because I'm so wonderful and I'm doing all these great things for him. And so he tells him all these really cool things. I think you should put on the royal king robe on this person, and I think they should ride through the city. And he says all these things that should happen to them. And guess what? The king says, okay, Haman, that's what I want you to do for Mordecai, because we never rewarded him for that plot he had discovered about me, that someone was trying to hurt me and Mordecai stopped it. So Haman, I want you to go and honor Mordecai. And so that was probably Haman. That was something that he was not expecting. And so that's what he had to do. And so then Esther is deciding what to do to help this situation with her people. And so she actually has the king and Haman come for a dinner. And she makes them this nice dinner, and she does it 2 nights in a row. And then she tells the king about the plot to kill people, but they were her people. And so the king is very upset, and what ends up happening is Haman and his family are killed because of the king realizes what he's really doing, and the Jewish people are saved. And so we see that God used wicked people. He used a king that didn't believe in God, but he still preserved his people. And so this book of the Bible, I think you would really enjoy reading it. I hope that you'll go through it and try to read different chapters and see what happens. See if you find the word God in there. It's not mentioned, and it's very unusual for it not to be mentioned, but it is very clear that it is showing us that God is always working behind the scenes. Even though sometimes maybe we can't see or we wonder what he's doing, we always know he's working. And so we know that God is preserving the line, and he is making it so that there is that Jewish line, that line from David that's going to go to Christ. And he was faithful to preserve that line. And he even used wicked people in an unbelieving country and city to accomplish that. So we can trust him to be faithful in our lives and what he has called us to do.